Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our Ringlers from across the world. I'm so delighted to be with you all today. My name is Jackie, in case we haven't met already. I graduated from Yale University with a bachelor's in psychology, and I am a writer and editor here on Ringle's very own content team. I'll take a brief second to tell you guys a little bit about me. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana, originally. If you're unfamiliar with US geography, it's this little city in the center of the US, about 3 hours drive from Chicago. Very uninteresting. I wouldn't visit. I'm an avid runner, eater, and reader. So those are my three big defining characteristics, right? I like to run, I like to eat, and I like to read. And today I'm super, super excited to talk to you about Thanksgiving. So for today's course, a little bit of breakdown of our agenda, right? We're going to start with a brief intro and context for the given history of Thanksgiving, right? Um, we'll jump into this read and digest, taking up the bulk of our time, looking into sort of the history, the news article that we were supposed to read together, and then jumping into a deep dive for those useful expressions. And then finally, we'll do a little bit of a wrap up and a pop quiz. So pay attention, because there will be a quiz at the end of this, as well as throughout, little polls to keep you guys engaged. Great. So a little bit to start about Thanksgiving as a general overview, right? Happens on the fourth Thursday, the last Thursday of November. The date itself is not set. And subsequently then, Black Friday is the Friday that follows, right? Um, People from the US in general will travel from wherever they are back home to have this holiday with their family. So it is a very busy travel time, right? The crux of the holiday, right? Like most holidays, is a large meal. It's about feasting with the family, right? Of course, it's also about giving thanks. So the giving thanks portion is usually done before the meal. Some people have a tradition right before eating of praying. Some other people might go around the table and say, okay, everyone, let's say one thing that we're very thankful for, that we're grateful for to have before this meal. But an interesting note is this notion, point number 5 here, of Friendsgiving celebrations, right? So I would say Thanksgiving differs from those traditional holidays in the sense that it's a little bit lower stakes, right? Whereas like Christmas and, certain holidays you would think, has to be celebrated with family. Thanksgiving can sometimes be celebrated with just a group of friends together. So Friendsgiving celebrations are rising in popularity. So, a little bit about the background. How did Thanksgiving begin, right? What was the first Thanksgiving as it was celebrated, right? This happened right on or around November in 1621, after the first American settlers that we call the Pilgrims came and sort of sat down and had this meal, right? And it was a 3-day long feast attended by 90 Native American Wampanoag people and 53 survivors of the Mayflower. So, how do we want to think about Thanksgiving, right? For a holiday, right? A lot of the way that it came to sort of exist was that colonies and states celebrated days of Thanksgiving for almost 2 centuries. But then in 1863, it was only in 1863 that then President Abraham Lincoln made it into an official holiday, right? So, when we think about the holiday in schools, it's one of those holidays that's not really deeply, deeply taught on, right? It's really just sometimes discussed as a peaceful union of the people, the Native American people and the Pilgrims, with a lot of culturally insensitive images and tropes, a lot of turkeys that are smiling and joyful, and not so much discussion into the darker aspects of history. But it is worth knowing that, like a lot of history in America, that there is a lot of dark past, right? It's much more complex and painful, especially on the Native American side, right? Um, so while Thanksgiving is often looked at as this holiday that is, one that's peaceful and happy and joyful, It really was one with a very extended and dark and bloody history, right? So, the American Indian Wars, which was a big conflict spanning some 200 or so years, led to hundreds and thousands of deaths, tribal loss, and forced relocation that sort of have implications even today, which is what you guys read in the article about some of these modern day implications, right? And so, since starting from the 1970s, protesters have really gathered on Thanksgiving in Coles Hill, overlooking Plymouth Rock, that location of historical significance, to commemorate a day of mourning also during Thanksgiving. All right, so next up, we're going to take a deeper dive into our read and digest. There are some select passages that I pulled out of the article that I wanted to highlight keywords for, and that's what we'll be doing going forward from here. As a reminder, the article that I hope you all got a chance to read is from BBC, always a reliable source. Why some push back against the holiday's mythology, right? Referring to the sort of culture that's been built around Thanksgiving. Three key passages that I've chosen from the article to pull out for you guys, right? First one being the issues surrounding Thanksgiving, right? Why Thanksgiving itself is painful for Native Americans. And then finally, how we understand and choose to recognize this past, how we reconcile the history of this holiday with our current present. So, to start with passage number 1 as a brief little synopsis here, right? The reminder that it's not the Thanksgiving dinner itself, but how people remember this holiday, right? With a lot of holidays, it's always about its historical significance, right? It's a note that Thanksgiving is a painful reminder for a lot of Native Americans. And finally, that it wasn't just a celebration, it was part of a long, bloody conflict in the context of war, right? So if you have the article pulled up, you can join me. Otherwise, just join me on the slide as we go through this reading together. As many Americans prepare for a massive holiday meal, the setting sun on Thanksgiving's Eve will mark the last time Keisha James eats for nearly 24 hours. She will not be in the kitchen basting a turkey, baking macaroni and cheese, or sprinkling sugar on pies either. Miss James will be in mourning. For her, the day is a painful reminder of an ugly chapter in American history, a symbol of empty promises, a story whose retelling tends to gloss over the undesirable details of colonization. We don't have any issues with people sitting down with their family and giving thanks, Miss James said. What we do object to is the Thanksgiving mythology. The gathering is widely seen as a celebration of the alliance between two groups, but leaves out the ways in which those ties were broken. In the years after the harvest feast, foreign-born diseases arriving from Europe killed many Native Americans. Others died during conflict with English settlers seeking to gain control of their land. The US government sought to forcibly assimilate children at over 400 government boarding schools operated between 1819 and 1969. All right, so deep dive into some of the vocabulary there that we cover. This is about a minority perspective on Thanksgiving that, we wanted to bring up and share with you guys. But Thanksgiving's Eve will mark the last time someone does something, right? So marking here is an indication of a stage in development, right? So our example, after years of hard work and dedication, she finally managed to mark her presence in the competitive business world, right? Think about it as sort of like drawing a little line, making that record, right? Marking a new record in the books, right? Writing down that new record. I decided to make my mark in January of 2021 when I broke the world record, right? Leaving that mark is leaving that indicator of something of significance. Next, few little Thanksgiving words that you might run into if you ever celebrate Thanksgiving. Basting a turkey, right, is sort of preparing the turkey. Baking macaroni and cheese, putting it in the oven, baking, or sprinkling sugar, putting a little bit of sugar in your pies, right? All these are traditional food items at Thanksgiving: turkey, mac and cheese, pies, lots of lovely, lovely, yummy foods. And mourning. Mourning is that expression of deep sorrow, often associated for death. Doesn't necessarily have to be death. It could just be someone who's upset and grieving about something that happened, right? So the entire community came together in mourning after the sudden and tragic loss of their beloved mayor, right? The act of mourning follows a lot of social convention and culture. So people mourn at a funeral, but you can also mourn, for example, if you want to be dramatic, I could say, my favorite restaurant no longer serves spaghetti. So I'm mourning the loss of the spaghetti at the restaurant, right? So it is one of those things that expresses deep sorrow, disappointment for something. Okay. So a little bit about the context here, right? So we talked about this being a painful reminder of an ugly chapter in American history, right? History, oftentimes when we talk about it, we'll refer to it like chapters, not unlike a book, right? So chapter in time of American history is earlier on, right? Periods that we'll describe as chapters. In this case, we're talking about the genocide of Native Americans, the mass murder and sort of like upset that was painful and ugly in this time of US growth. All right, so a symbol of empty promises. This is another useful vocab phrase that you might run into in a lot of business contexts. Empty promises. What is an empty promise? It's a promise that's not carried out. It's worthless, it's meaningless. Someone might be complaining and say, "Oh my gosh, like this marketing department is always making empty promises. They're not following through with what they say they're going to do." Or as an example, after numerous empty promises from the politician, the voters became disillusioned and skeptical about positive change. That's something that people might say. Bad politicians are making empty promises all the time, right? So it's the idea that someone made a promise and it's not binding. That's why the promise is empty. Note that we don't really say like there's no opposite. There's no like full promise. There's only empty promises. If a full promise is kept, it's just a promise. Okay, then we have retelling, right? So what does retelling mean, right? So it's a new version of an old story. It doesn't necessarily mean a bad version or a deeply adjusted version, but in this case, it kind of does. But in general, it just means a new version of an older story. So in this retelling of Romeo and Juliet, Juliet sings from the balcony to Romeo, or in this retelling of a classic tale, the three little pigs live in Houston, Texas, so it's one of those stories that have been told again, right? Oftentimes, though, it does mean there have been slight changes, right? Meaning, characters, or just modernization, anything like that of a story. In the case of this article, it's talking about, negative adjustments. Okay, and then glossing over, right? The story tends to gloss over the details of colonization. That's another word that you might hear often in a more class setting, which is that the teacher might deem something less important, right? Not super significant for remembering, and they'll gloss over it. Or I might say, hey, I don't have time. I don't have time to cover this right now, so I'm just going to gloss over it, meaning I'm going to just sort of move on past it, right? So in this case, this is something that for a negative context, it would be making something that's negative seem unimportant, right? But in general, it's just the making of something into something unimportant, right? So the tour guide glossed over the fact that the food at the dining hall was not good, right? So you gloss over things by mentioning it quickly and then moving on. A kid could be like, I want to gloss over the fact that my room is messy. So just glossing over something. All right. And then another deep dive into that historical context that I'm going to keep reminding you guys about, right? That Thanksgiving in a lot of other parts of American history, right? Columbus Day and whatnot have evolved into myths, into its own sort of mythology, right? So think Greek myths, epics, these traditional stories. A lot of the American figures, right, have become almost idolized, like George Washington, right? And we talk about here the truth behind the myths, right? What the people in this article are facing, what they're angry about, is about the mythology. The common understanding of Thanksgiving as a positive, not positive, but rather as a holiday that that has no negative components. So again, continuing, right? For a lot of Americans, right, Thanksgiving itself is the celebration that people are really excited to, but they don't think at all about the historical past, right? The citizens that were injured in the context of it, that were hurt, and so it's super fine to still gather around with family for Thanksgiving, but it's important as well to acknowledge the past and the history of it fully. Perfect. All right. So next up, we have alliance between two groups, right? What is an alliance, right? It's exactly that sort of a relationship, an organization between two groups that are sharing a common interest, share something in common, right? So you could say that generally it's used with nations, right? But you could say two organizations are aligned. It's generally bigger things. I could say, oh yeah, me and my colleague are aligned, against, someone else in the company, but that's less often the case. It's more often between bigger, more powerful groups, organizations, nations, kind of. The US-South Korea alliance is a security alliance to maintain peace in the region. All right. So, breaking ties. Ties were broken. Again, this is once again a return on this notion of promises, right? A breakdown of trust. Usually, if ties were broken, trust was broken. Our professional ties were broken with that company. We no longer work with them. So think about a string tying two people together. The string is now broken. All right. Foreign born, right? So in the years after the harvest feast, foreign-born diseases arriving from Europe killed many Native Americans. So foreign-born just means not born in the land, right? So I was foreign-born. I wasn't foreign-born, but some people were foreign-born, right? Not originating in that country. So it looks like our example here, foreign-born residents made up 12% of the total US population in 2010, right? So it most generally refers to people. It really, really does. But in this case, we're using it to describe a disease, right? You can maybe stretch it and use it to describe a thing, but I wouldn't really say like, oh, my iPhone is foreign born. It was foreign born, but that's a little weird. So generally keep it to people if you're not sure how to use it. All right. So assimilate, right? To become similar, to incorporate something, right? It's generally to incorporate something into a bigger and continuous whole, right? So you want me to assimilate, but I can't. I'm my own person and I can't act like everyone else. Assimilate has a negative, it can have a negative connotation, right? Meaning that people are forced to change aspects of their culture when assimilating, right? Oftentimes, some scholars of history will use the term integrate when talking about adaptation because integrate has less of this feeling of, in history, assimilation feels like if we say we assimilated those people, it means we took their culture and kind of erased it and they became part of our culture. Whereas integrating feels a little bit more, a little less violent, right? A little less erasure wise. It's very sort of more inclusive feeling. Why is Thanksgiving painful for Native Americans, right? So as a summary, Native Americans faced a lot of historical trauma in our history. The Indian Removal Act and Trail of Tears are examples of this trauma. And so that addresses Yule's question, I think, a little bit. And then finally, that Thanksgiving can simply be a reminder of these traumas for them. So go ahead and join me now in the reading if you would like. Historians attribute the rise in activism for Native Americans in the 1970s to momentum driven by Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement the decade prior. They also draw awareness to what University of Arizona anthropology professor Edward Jolie calls historical traumas, like what was done to Native Americans in the wake of the Indian Removal Act signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. During the 1830s, roughly 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly moved from the southeast region of the U.S. to areas west of the Mississippi River. It's estimated around 15,000 died on the journey, known today as the Trail of Tears. That's something that I think a lot of people overlook or don't appreciate, just how raw and very real and ever-present these types of historical traumas are for a lot of Native peoples, he said. So, reading into the context here, right, the author is drawing a parallel between two movements in American history, the Black American Civil Rights Movement and Native Americans' fight for rights as well, right? This also inspired a lot of the early activism in the 1960s, inspired a lot of movements after that, right? Including for the LGBTQ communities and women's rights that followed in the US. So draw awareness to. If something is drawing awareness to something else, right, it's pointing out something as important, right? So think about, I want to take a moment now to draw awareness of how important it is to recycle. I want to draw awareness about the importance of addressing global warming. You know, the phrase is often to point out something that's overlooked, right? Something that really needs to be looked at and focused on. So trauma is a word that we'll take a deeper dive into, right? But people talk about historical trauma here, right? Historical trauma being what happened to the Native Americans, but generational trauma, which is something that creates physical effect through generations, is something that happens from one generation onto the next. So think about generational trauma in the context of families, right? It can be something that happened to a group, right? But then it's passed down in the form of family distress from one generation to the next, right? So, you know, my father's history, you know, he's passed on some generational trauma from his history onto me. It's something that can sort of move on in the sense of generations. Trauma can also be used, besides sort of in the most violent term of history, it can be more generally used to talk about more like family abuses, right? Or family trauma, right? Parent trauma, things like that can all be described as trauma. It doesn't have to be physical. In the wake of, following something as a consequence, right? This is a useful word in writing if you're ever going to, you know, use it, which is, you know, this event happened in the wake of the previous incident, right? So the committee was set up in the wake of the inquiry, right? So the committee was set up as a result, as a consequence of the inquiry, directly following it, though. So a little bit more context here for all of you, right? The Indian Removal Act was one of those laws in 1830 that was signed onto by Andrew Jackson, who was then president, right? And what it did was it resettled Native Americans from east of the Mississippi River, where they were, to lands west, right? The removal was technically voluntary, right? But eventually it became mandatory, right? Through necessity. And of course, these mandatory removals of Indians ended up being very sort of, you know, traumatic, right? Lives were lost, and the loss of a lot of land also took place there. Forcibly. What does it mean to forcibly do something? It's to do it with violence, right? So when the man wouldn't stop shouting, the guards forcibly took him out of the building, right? I did not sign up to do this. I was made to do it forcibly. When growing up, I didn't like eating broccoli, but someone would forcibly make me eat the broccoli, right? So something about done against someone's wishes, done against someone's will, done sort of by force rather than elsewhere. It doesn't have to be physical, but usually is described as physical. Okay, so the Trail of Tears, right? Another dark time in American history that you might hear was about the forced relocation in the 1830s of the indigenous people in the southeast region of the United States. So that was the Indian Territory, so-called west of the Mississippi River. And so that included a lot of the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Seminoles, among other Indian groups, right? So they made this journey to Indian territory on foot. They were made to make this relocation on foot, right? Without any food, any supplies, or other help from the government. And thousands of people died on this journey, right, on this trail. And so one Choctaw leader actually told an Alabama leader and described it as a trail of tears and death. So overlooking, right? Overlooking something is to fail to see something, right? So it's not necessarily, it's generally used in a sort of negative context. So please write a to-do list so you don't overlook any important details for the parties, right? My boss overlooked me when it came to the promotion this year, right? It means to look on over the top of something, right? That's the literal meaning, but it's always, almost always used to refer to the act of neglecting something, right? I overlooked the need for water and I passed out in the middle of the marathon, right? It's just because your focus is somewhere else usually. Raw, what does raw mean, right? In food, raw means, uncooked, right? But in this case, we talk about a natural state that is now still unchanged and unfiltered. So instead, harsh or fresh. In this case, right? The wound on my arm is still raw. It's still bleeding. I need a Band-Aid, right? I can also refer to emotion, right? This is a very raw feeling. This is a very painful, a very sort of pure, in a sense, feeling, right? If I say raw anger, it's just very pure, very aggressive anger that I'm expressing, right? Okay, ever present, right? Ever present means existing all the time, right? His face is always hidden by his ever-present baseball cap, right? Think about it as something that's always there. In this article's case, it's talking about a weight that's always there, but you can say a lot of things are ever present. My mother's voice is ever present in my head. My dreams about the future are ever present as a motivator for everything I do in my day-to-day life. My fear of gaining weight is ever present deep inside my mind. All of these things, ever present, always there. Okay. And then moving on to the final passage here. How do we understand and recognize this past, right? So 3 main points here. Boarding schools were also horrific places for Native Americans. This fraught history continues to hurt Native Americans. And then finally, by recognizing the past, we can move forward and still celebrate Thanksgiving as a holiday. So in May, the U.S. Department of the Interior released a report describing the former federal boarding schools as places rampant with physical and sexual abuse, overcrowding, malnourishment, and disease. Facts which the report said were well documented. The deaths of at least 500 Native children were also documented in the report, a number expected to rise as the U.S. government continues to look into the troubled legacy of those institutions. This fraught history, Mr. Jolie said, is why the Thanksgiving holiday for some, when only reflected upon as a happy gathering between pilgrims and Native Americans, is a painful reminder. Still, he says it's his favorite holiday, offering the opportunity to spend time with his family and enjoy dishes like green bean casserole. Mr. Jolie does, however, have a few hopes for the future, that as people continue to gather, celebrate, and be thankful, they will do so with a healthy recognition of the past. So here in the context, in the past, Native children were forcibly separated from their parents and sent to these schools where they were abused and beaten. They were forced to give up their culture, and they were beaten if they wore traditional clothes or spoke in their native language. And the phrase of these schools was actually to kill the Indian, save the man. You see this in a lot of history, a lot of countries, right? With a lot of indigenous tribes are always like, don't speak your language, assimilate into our culture. Something that happens a lot, unfortunately, more frequently than it should, or shouldn't really happen. So the places were rampant with. So rampant with something means having some negative thing a lot that's out of control, right? Weeds are growing rampant in the garden, right? If you don't like children, the children are running rampant around the house, right? So happening a lot, becoming worse, out of control, negative connotation always, something that's bad, full of bad things. The schools were rampant with abuse. Overcrowding, right? So you can use this in a lot of contexts to describe, too many people in one place, too many things going on. The farm had an issue of overcrowding with animals in the small space, right? I felt like overcrowding was a serious risk on that subway platform, right? I think that overcrowding is an issue on the train. Sorry, I keep using train examples, but that's what I'm thinking about right now. Well documented, right? Well documented means that there's a lot of clear history to support something. There's a lot of clear evidence and documents, right? So we might say the allegations about abuse at my job were well documented, right? The issues at the school were well documented. Let's see, that part of her life is not well documented since there are no records from that time, right? So not well documented is something as well. There's something that doesn't have much proof. It helps make an argument stronger if you say that it's well documented. If it's true, obviously you have to back up your statements. Troubled legacy. This is a very interesting sort of word, I think, right? It's about how something or someone's remembered in a complicated or negative way, right? So legacy is how you are remembered, right? So it's like, what is my legacy going to be? So what is my legacy going to be means how will I be remembered after I die, right? So legacy is how someone or something is remembered. And troubled, of course, then means it's a little bit complicated, right? It's not necessarily all positive. Legacy, usually you want it to be positive. You want there to be some sort of like goodness that comes out of it, of remembering a legacy. Okay, and then fraught history. This is another really useful word, right? Causing emotional distress or uneasy, right? They had a fraught relationship full of tension, right? It means kind of rocky relationship, right? It's used to refer to ships, right? With the full loads, right? The fraught. But now it mainly is used for those situations, heavy with tension, heavy with emotion, right? It's kind of a fraught situation. It's kind of a delicate situation, tense situation there. Fraught. And then finally, reflected upon, right? This is something that I think you can also add into your like daily, day-to-day verbiage. I reflected upon a situation, right? To think about something, to consider something. If you reflect upon your past experiences, you look at them thoughtfully, right? It's about considering or thinking about new possibilities for something. I reflected upon my decisions in the past 2 years, and I was full of regret. Or I reflected upon my conversation with my ex, and I thought that I made some mistakes. Or I reflected upon the meal we had yesterday, and I thought it was delicious. So reflected upon, thinking back to something. Okay, so a little more historical context here for your deep dive, right? So, excuse me, Mr. Jolie mentions that this happy gathering is a painful reminder, right? So this article will repeat phrases to readers for them to remember. And the phrase that's repeated here a lot is just painful reminder of the past, not a joyful reminder of history, right? And then as a sort of concluding thought here, the article wants to emphasize understanding, remembering, and recognizing, right? This helps to rewrite that narrative about Thanksgiving, to restore how Thanksgiving is considered of something else, as something else, right? So this person uses the term healthy to describe the recognition of the past, and that healthy meaning, like everything else in life, right? Like when we think back when I think back to my sort of childhood, there are negative times and positive times. And so, recognizing the negative as well as the positive, rather than thinking, oh, I was only happy in childhood, is how this person thinks about healthy recognition of history. Finally, in the last 10 or 15 minutes, I want to take us a little bit of time to wrap up the key points from the article, as well as some of those key expressions to keep in mind going forward for your own reading, speaking, and writing. And there's a pop quiz, so pay attention. Key points from the article that you read, right? So the controversy around Thanksgiving isn't about the meal, but how people and how children remember its origin and its history, the story around it, right? For Native Americans in the US, Thanksgiving serves as a painful reminder of historical traumas like the Indian Removal Act. And finally, more in history, learning about and remembering these historical traumas can help us rewrite the story of Thanksgiving, right? Learning about the negative of the past can help us to acknowledge it and to move forward positively in general, right? So some key expressions we learned, right? Fraught history. Fraught. Learning about America's fraught history is a difficult but important task. Gloss over. Typical Thanksgiving celebrations gloss over the historical traumas of Native communities. Drawing awareness to. By drawing awareness to these issues, we can better understand why Native communities are in mourning during Thanksgiving, why some Native communities are in mourning during Thanksgiving. I wanted to say thank you all so much for taking the time out of the day to join me. It's been an absolute pleasure being with all of you all.